the fact that things aren't right in terms of social relationships. But what Marx says is that the problem is religion can't really understand why these conditions are the way they are, and that religion can't overturn those traditions, okay? Or overturn those conditions. So this is important to make, that there is this opening within Marx to kind of understand that religion kind of can point to reality and the reality of suffering, but that religion doesn't help to overturn or change those conditions, and instead legitimates those conditions, okay? So kind of a classic idea in people who think about ideology is that ideology is fractured, it's kind of chopped into pieces, and that ideology isn't totally coherent. So we've got, in this classic example, we've got an ideology, i.e. religion, that in Marx's understanding can kind of point to, oh my gosh, there's oppression and suffering, and we have to explain that, so it points to something real, but in explaining that, it explains it away, and actually for Marx doesn't get to the root of what causes those oppressive and those suffering conditions, okay? So that's classic Marx. Now, one other step in the history of ideology, if you will, and I hope you've encountered this person before, and that's Antonio Gramsci. What Gramsci does is he looks at Marx and he goes, well, this is Gramsci's writing in the 1920s, 1930s, says, well, the worldwide Marxist revolution hasn't happened. What is it that makes it so that the proletariat cannot see? In other words, cannot actually get past the obscured vision of ideology and actually see what's causing inequality, see the conditions of the economy. And Gramsci introduces this terrific phrase of hegemony. And what Gramsci says is that ideology, in the Marxist sense, is a little too deterministic. In other words, Marx basically says, starts as the base, and the base creates ideology. But he gives no account of how that really happens or how the ideology spreads. So Gramsci says, well, this phrase hegemony is a way of thinking about this, because hegemony is basically the common sense nature of ideology. Hegemony is what's in our heads and the way we live our lives that make it feel as if the way we're living our lives is the only way to live our lives, and life has to be lived in the way that we are living it. Gramsci says things like common sense, phrases, explanations about all sorts of pieces of the social world, recreate ideology, but recreate it in a way that it's not like controlling or pressed on some devious class, but we recreate it ourselves. It's recreated in organizations, sayings, the educational system, all these ways. And so in the end, Gramsci kind of gives an even more scary vision of ideology, and saying that it's kind of built up in all these small little ways every single day. It's more nefarious version, but it's less heavy-handed because he implicates our role in reproducing ideology. What's interesting about Gramsci is when he gives this explanation, he has a place for the role of intellectuals. So he talks about the role that priests, lawyers, judges, doctors have in reproducing hegemony all the time. What he calls traditional intellectuals, people who find upstanding leaders and members of the community whose kind of thoughts and common sense are looked to and kind of usually kind of control the thought of the day. So that's kind of a local level way that hegemony and ideology are recreated. So Gramsci has a role for intellectuals, something that Marx didn't really talk about. And he also organizations. So these would be things like his Rotary clubs, labor unions, that sort of thing. And says that oftentimes these two things together are the way that ideology kind of gets reproduced in a very kind of daily, local, common sense sort of way. What's interesting for Gramsci is that both of these things, organizations and intellectuals, can potentially overturn the way, the state of ideology as it is. So Gramsci spends a lot of his time working with communist groups in Italy, especially labor and in manufacturing groups, trying to develop intellectuals and to develop organizations that can think for themselves, that can look at the social conditions of their reality and come up with diagnoses and analyses and actions in order to try and make those things better. So it's where Marx kind of has this idea kind of about the revolution of a particular class overthrowing this other class. Gramsci gets into much more kind of details about the way this can happen on local levels. What's interesting, whereas when we said Marx had a catch where religion actually does do something in terms of expressing suffering, Gramsci has a catch. So in general, his theory says that priests who are intellectuals and churches, which are organizations, they're just going to kind of reproduce hegemony and ideology and kind of gloss over things and aren't going to help in terms of any sort of reformation of society. The catch is, though, is that in his theory, he says if intellectuals and if organizations can be independent, in other words, if they can generate themselves and be trained to look on reality for themselves, i.e. not controlled by the elite, not controlled by capitalists, then both of these had the possibility to develop ideology that can potentially kind of overturn or develop ideology that can see through the dominant hegemony and begin to help kind of overturn and fix the social conditions of reality. So what I'm saying, in both of these people, both Gramsci and Marx, there's elements of where religion might play out differently, but in their theories, the way they articulated it, religion had a conservative role, i.e. a role of kind of reproducing dominant social and economic relationships. Now Zuckerman kind of plays this out a little, and what I think is a terrific chapter from Zuckerman. He gives example of how religion can reflect inequalities in social life, and also how religion can be forced to change because of social changes that go around it. Now he picks two examples, the example of race in the Church of Latter-day Saints, and the example of the role of religion in, or role of women in Jewish congregations. But there's a million different examples they both could have chosen. A bunch of you said this in your online discussions that talked about things like religious groups and what they say against homosexuality, religious groups. Somebody also brought up religious groups and the state of relations in regard to abortion. Somebody brought up religion and militarization. And then a lot of you brought up really what's the topic of next week, which is certain groups within Islam that have used religion as a way to legitimate kind of violent actions and their own violent actions, especially against innocent people. So Zuckerman has a way of showing how this ideology can play out with religion, how religion can remake ideology, but then how religion can be used to justify all sorts of kind of claims or actions about the world. What we're going to do for next week is basically look at that religious ideology can perpetuate violence and can perpetuate kind of nefarious effects within the social world. Whereas the week after that, as we start to wrap up the course, we're going to look at how religion can actually develop kind of a critical consciousness around social conditions and can actually be used, can actually be a main part of social movements, a main way to kind of try and overcome social injustice that's been legitimated. But before we get there, let me take us back to the puzzle that I posed in the last lecture. And the puzzle was to look at the reading from Pope, and then this example I gave you from this guy Billings. Now Pope, as I said before, is studying Gastonia, and he finds all this evidence, and you guys did a terrific job of pointing this out, of how religion legitimates the economic relations of Gastonia. And you gave a bunch of examples. For example, religion is funded by the capitalists. Many of you